Bonjour et bienvenue à Nice Fiction. So, welcome everybody around the world to this meeting and conversation around Ukrainian SF in the context of the Nice Fiction Speculative Fiction Festival in Nice, France. And today's conversation was titled Ukrainian Speculative Fiction from romanticism to postmodernism, and from colonial to post-colonial. It's going to be happening in English. I don't think we're going to be taking any questions. I forgot to ask Sybille Marqueteau about that. But if any questions are transferred to us in either French or English, we'll try and answer, and possibly we might be able to handle Ukrainian through the chat. I don't know if much more than that. So I have the great pleasure of introducing a Ukrainian science fiction writer and professor, Mykhailo Nazarenko, and I will. He's an assistant professor, last I heard anyway, at the East Slavic Philology and Practical Information Studies Department of the Educational and Scientific Institute of Philology of Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. And I will interject right now that I speak. I'll say the same thing I tell my students from time to time when I'm taking their names. We have very international classes at the universities where I teach as a part-time professor, that there are something like 7,000 still living languages on this planet. I speak 2.5 of them. And that does not include Russian or Ukrainian. My friend of mine who is a Russian speaker tells me I have an atrocious accent in Russian. And so please forgive my mispronunciation of either Ukrainian or Russian names as we go along. Hopefully, and Mr. Nazarenko, Professor Nazarenko, if you prefer, you may also correct me with for the pronunciation of your name.
Nazarenko.
Nazarenko?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so dobry den.
Hello. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Yes. Covering lots of bases. So I'm thinking that we're going to perhaps kind of cover both kind of the history and perhaps some of the concerns raised by the recent evolution of science fiction, or I'll say speculative fiction to include fantasy in Ukraine. This is probably a first for me in terms of having a conversation with a writer from a country at war, and I hope you are as well as possible and as safe as possible under the circumstances. The historical context is interesting if we look at the history of science fiction, because there have been in the past, in the history of science fiction, cases where wars weighed very much on the evolution of science fiction and let us say, the speculative fiction writing community in various countries. For any English speakers in the audience, I might recall, for instance, the divisions in the US around the Vietnam War, or the war in Vietnam. And earlier in the 20th century, historians of science fiction have pointed to a decline of science fiction in places like France and England after World War I, due in part to the people who died, but also due in part to a change in perhaps a popular mood in connection with science fiction. Fantasy is perhaps a slightly different issue. So if we start, however, with kind of trying to understand the history of speculative fiction in Ukraine, and I've read your article with Mr. Arenev.
Arenev, yes.
Arenev.
Volodymyr Arenev.
I read the French version. I think I saw that it was published in Clark's World as well in English. I believe they're probably the same.
Yes, it's the same article.
Yes. Okay. So, as I recall, we're going back to roughly the 19th century, though, of course, when we speak about the fantastical, I assume there's also this long folk tradition of tales, fairy tales, marvelous stories, and so on. Do you want to and the title of this conversation, and I've been speaking a bit too much already, has to do with, seems to start with kind of this, the Romantic period and the what might be called the colonial period. And for you, are these the same?
Well, I'd start from some earlier times, 16th, 17th century, when the major part of Ukraine was belonged to Lithuania or Poland, and at that time, the Ukrainian literature was mainly written in three languages: Old Ukrainian, Polish, and Latin. And one of the first works of fantastic in Ukraine was written in Latin. It was a poem describing the lands of Ruthenia, of what we now call Ukraine, and the local witches, their charms, their ways, and the ways to fight them. So the local folk tradition was very powerful even then, and it has a direct influence on the literature of the time. But the real development of the genre, or the sources of the genre as we know it in the 20th century, belonged to the time of the Romanticism. And yes, it was the time of it was the colonial past of Ukraine, because it was divided between Austro-Hungary and Russia, and it's still the Ukrainian literature of the 19th century was mainly bilingual. Almost every Ukrainian writer of the time wrote in Ukrainian and Russian, or even only in Russian, as Mykhailo Gogol, well known in Europe as Nikolai Gogol, the Russian version of his name. He identified himself as Ukrainian or Little Russian, Malorus, and as a part of the greater unity that he named Rus, and he identified that Rus with the Russian Empire. But still, two first books of Gogol were tales of fantastic that took place in Ukraine. They were based upon Ukrainian folklore, and Gogol tried to present this folk tradition to all readers of the empire. So he was one of those writers who created the image of Ukraine as a peaceful, somewhat weird land with great past, but essentially with no future outside the empire. And the past 17th century, 18th century was described as a space and time when the werewolves, volkalaki, witches, dwarves, mermaids, rusalki, and other mythical creatures existed side by side with local people, and these entities, these characters, could be both funny or terrifying in Gogol's writing. And all of them were part of the bigger Gogol's world, the world where the powers of evil are immensely powerful, and there are only two ways of beating them. The first one is the laughter, and the second one is the prayer. So he tried to combine both of these forces, power and Christian prayer. I think it will not be an exaggeration to say that Gogol's vision of Ukraine formed a bigger part of the of later Ukrainian literature, and especially Ukrainian speculative fiction, fantasy, and even SF, science fiction. But Gogol wasn't the only writer of the time who used the folk tradition in his works. There were other who wrote in Ukrainian, and so they are less known in Europe. And in any case, Gogol was the most talented of them all. But there were other romantic writers who tried, first of all, to define what is it to be Ukrainian. What is Ukraine? We know its past, we know its folk tradition, but what can we say about its future using the same patterns, the same folk stories or folk imagery? And so the most important writer, Ukrainian writer of the 19th century, and the most important Ukrainian writer of all time, perhaps, was Taras Shevchenko, the greatest Ukrainian poet, the center of the Ukrainian, of the canon of the Ukrainian literature. And he used the folk tradition in very peculiar way. For example, he wrote a poem that he called a mystery or a miracle, which combines tales about the forsaken souls who are not allowed to go to heaven or hell because they involuntarily helped to the enemies of Ukraine. Three evil crows who, one from Poland, one from Russia, and one from Ukraine, who represent the evil of the national souls, so to say, and the imagery of the Великий Льох, the great cellar, that is it's not a folk image, it's the image created by Taras Shevchenko himself. It's a mystical space that contains the essence of the Ukraine. As long as the great cellar is undisturbed, Ukraine exists, and it can rise from this great cellar as Jesus Christ rised from the cave, rised from the dead. So when Gogol used the folklore imagery to represent the colonial state of Ukraine, Ukraine is basically dead. We can use its folklore, its folk songs, and so on and so on, but Ukraine it doesn't exist and will never exist as an independent land, independent country. And Taras Shevchenko uses the same images, the same folklore, to say that Ukraine can be resurrected by the actions of every man, every woman, and so. But how it will be? It can be only described in a mystical way, in a fantastical way, in a symbolic ways. So these two folklore-based visions of Ukraine were um, basically the opposite ones, and it is telling that in Russian vision of Ukraine, the Gogol's model was the basic one, and in the Ukrainian self-consciousness, the Shevchenko's model was the basics for all the later writers. And so basically, Gogol and Shevchenko are the main figures of the Ukrainian Romanticism and of the Ukrainian literature of the 19th century. And then we have the period of realism, the second part of the 19th century. But of course, the realists were more interested in the describing the Ukraine, the social modes of Ukraine, the real life, so-called real life of Ukraine of that time. And so for several decades, the literature of the fantastic, I don't say that it disappears entirely, but it loses its attraction. The real life becomes more important, though even in the second part, in the late decades of the 19th century, there were writers who described the ancient history, the history of Kiev and Rus, using the mythological images. I'd say that these writers described the old history, mythological history of Ukraine, in the same way as Richard Wagner described the mythological history of Germans and Scandinavians in his operas. So these writers were not popular at the time because the mythical way of describing the Ukraine wasn't popular in the age of realism, but still they existed, and they showed to the later writers that it can be done. It really can be done. And what's more important, the history of the Kievan Rus from 8th to 12th century, that was officially the part of the Russian history. These writers rewrote it as a part of the Ukrainian history, and it became very important in the 20th century.
Thank you. Before we go on to perhaps, yes, the modern era, let's see. First of all, I was reading recently that in the context of the war, there's been a kind of renewed interest in Ukraine in indeed this tradition of witches. And I was reading about a play, perhaps, that has become very popular in Kiev, I think, and which features kind of these traditional witches or traditional witchery. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. In 1834, it was there was this tale was published. It's by Ukrainian prose writer, the beginner of the Ukrainian prose, Grigory Osnovyanenko. It's called The Witch of Konotop. Konotop is the city on the left bank of Dnieper. And it describes the real event when the local powers tried to drown the women that were supposed to be witches, Ukrainian analog of American Salem witches process. And but in this tale, these witches are real. It's a classic work that is taught in schools to this day, and there was a play based on it, and um, theater performance, the play in one of the best Kiev theaters is enormously popular. It's almost impossible to buy a ticket to see this play. And when the big war started in the big invasion started in 2022, the images of Ukrainian witches were actively used in mass media, in social networks. It wasn't a belief, but it was maybe wishful thinking that Ukrainian folklore or characters such as witches and so on, mermaids, rusalki, are helping to their people. The land itself, the inhabitants, the mythical inhabitants of the land, go to the war against the enemy, against the invaders, and due to that, the popularity of the Witch of Kontop became even greater than it was before 2022.
Yeah. And my second comment has me speaking more from my own location, because I'm a French Canadian writer, and French-speaking Canada was conquered by the British Empire, and has remained a part of the well, a majority of English speakers and an English-speaking polity. And in the 19th century, there is basically well, really a birth of French Canadian literature, which involves in part this rediscovery, this transposition, perhaps within literature, of various folk traditions, and and sometimes it is very kind of ethnographical, kind of just kind of finding the stories and telling them in print form. And as you pointed out, in the case of Wagner, this was part of this romantic tradition well, let us say, a Western civilization in Western countries at the time in the 19th century, that involved kind of delving into these traditional tales and incorporating them within literary works. In French Canada, or French-speaking Canada, we also have in the 19th century some first stirrings of science fiction, and there the stakes often seem to be modernization. Because there was this certainly this tension where the colonized French speakers felt were kind of being told to, let us say, admire the technological and industrial achievements of the British, and who were basically at the top of the economy of the 19th century world. So that in the 19th century, in this field, I see this tension between the fantastical drawing from folk traditions and as I said, the first stirrings of science fiction that involve imagining how in the future French-speaking Canada will be as modern as can be. Is there anything like that? You started to speak about realism, and I wasn't quite clear if you were talking about, let us say, the psychological novel of the late 19th century, or of Soviet realism in the first half of the 20th century. So, if we're going to move on to realism, can you kind of perhaps expound a bit about that?
Yeah, I meant the psychological novel of the 19th century, and the main theme of the realistic works of the 19th century was, of course, the life of Ukrainian villages, Ukrainian cities, and so on. And it's interesting that in the first decades of the 20th century, 1910s, there were a number of modernist works that reused their folkloric and mythological imagery. I'll name just two most important. They became popular later due to the movies or cartoons based upon them. The first is The Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors by Mykhailo Nazarenko. It was filmed as by Sergei Parajanov, and it is known in the Western world as The Horses of Fire. It's a tale about the inhabitants of the Carpathian Mountains that live side by side with the local mythical creatures. I'd say the closest thing in the Western literature, maybe it's The Celtic Twilight by William Butler Yeats. And simultaneously, Les Ukrainka, the greatest Ukrainian dramatist, wrote a dramatic poem or play influenced by Gerhard Hauptmann about the artist who lives again side by side with the mythological creatures, and it's basically a fable about the fate of the artist, of the person who tries to create his or her art against all the circumstances. And these works are enormously popular and influential, but the first Ukrainian science fiction wasn't written before, was written only in 1918, and it was published paradoxically in Toronto. It was, as you know, great Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and
Indeed.
one of these writers named Pavlo Krat wrote a novel about the life in the year 2000, and from that day it was important that every utopian or dystopian novel written by Ukrainians got to describe not only the life of the Earth in general, or Western Hemisphere, but where are we in this world? What will become what will the Ukraine become in the future? What will be the fate of the nation? And the most works of science fiction of the 1920s was written in the Soviet Ukraine, and they were mainly some kinds of communist utopias or dystopias. For example, the most popular work of the time was the novel by Volodymyr Vinnichenko, very popular even in the Western Europe, dramatist and novelist. And he wrote a typical European novel of the time. It's called The Sun Machine, as the typical post-H.G. Wells novel about the discovery that changes the life of the humanity. In this case, the possibility to receive enormous amounts of energy from the sunlight. And though Vinnichenko was a political immigrant, he lived in France. This novel was published in the Soviet Ukraine and was very popular till the 1930s, when every work of Ukrainian immigrants was forbidden in the Soviet Union, and it was rediscovered by the next generation of readers only in Perestroika time in 1980s, and it's read till this day, though it's not the best the best work. I'd say the best Ukrainian science fiction novel of the 20th century is the work is a novel that is called The Master of the Ship by Yuri Yanovsky. It was published in 1928, and it describes basically the contemporary reality. Yanovsky worked on the Odessa film studio with best writers and directors of the time, and he describes the events that took part in Odessa in 1920s as a memoir written by a person who remembers these things, these events in the communist future of the 1950s or 1960s. The romantic or realistic, neo-romantic description of the life of the Ukrainian life in Odessa in 1920s gets another dimension. We work today to build a future, and this is how the future will see us today. It's very interesting novel that combines memoirs, poems, notes on the margins of this memoir left by the first readers of the novel in this communist future, and so on. But such prose experiments were almost extinct in the 1930s when the socialist realism was declared as the only method of the Soviet writers' work. And so the Ukrainian SF from 1930s to, I'd say, 1980s, more than half a century, was rather mediocre, and it was mainly about communist future that was described as the powers that be ordered it to be described, and about professors and pioneers and heroic communists that go to Mars or Venus and so on, about robots, all the cliches of the of the Western science fiction that was allowed in the Soviet Union, and every truly original work of science fiction was extremely hard to get published. The best writers of the 60s and 70s had to wait for decades to get their works published, mainly in the late Soviet or independent Ukraine.
Well, that's a perfect segue to turn to perhaps the situation of speculative fiction in Ukraine, in independent Ukraine, Ukraine today, down to the most recent years. And it's the one question I might have about what we were just saying is you mentioned the work by Vinishenko, and then you mentioned Master of the Ship. Were these written in Russian or in Ukrainian?
These were written in Ukrainian
Okay.
because the Russian speaking writers were few in the first decades of the 20th century. The number grew due to the Russification of Ukraine, and so in the second half of the 20th century there was a number of Russian speaking or bilingual Ukrainian science fiction writers.
Mm-hmm.
But Vinchenko and Yanovsky were Ukrainian, wrote in Ukrainian.
Yes. When I was studying at the University of Toronto, often walked in front, passed in front of. There was an institute, I think, of Ukrainian studies there with the possibly a statue of Volodymyr the Great, Veliki Volodymyr,
Hmm.
in front of it. It was perhaps my first introduction to the Ukrainian language, because the inscription below the statue was, yes, I noticed the difference between Vladimir and Volodymyr.
Hmm.
The Yes, so you have a situation, I understand, in Ukraine since independence, and as you were just saying, since one might say Russification in the Soviet era of, well, effective bilingualism, which is something very familiar to me in Canada because we have French and English as official languages, and because of the huge influence of science fiction in English, a number of writers of science fiction and fantasy who may be francophones, who may speak French as a mother tongue. A number of them, including myself, have actually sometimes written in English, and it's a, and of course that and there is no kind of independent French speaking Canada or Quebec, and so there's sometimes this tension where is that contributing, let us say, uh, to the richness of Quebec or French Canadian literature. And of course, inversely, sometimes when going into schools as a writer, and just talking about what I do, some of the kids were asking, why don't you write, let us say, for Hollywood in English? And it's so there is this perhaps a split consciousness as to, on the one hand, you should be writing in French to kind of preserve the language, the culture, and the possible future of French culture in Canada, and the kind of the let us say very economic realism. And I think you did mention that, and in the article for Clark's World, the payoff, the income for people who were writing in Russian was greater than if they were wrote in Ukrainian. And so how and ha, so I got the impression from the article that since 1990 roughly, speculative fiction in Ukraine kind of evolved along twin tracks, perhaps partly in Russian, partly in Ukrainian. And is that correct? And what kind of influence do you think that's had on what was being written and published, perhaps?
Um, yes, it is true. I'd even say that in the 1980s, 1990s, and the first decade of the 21st century, the Ukrainian speculative fiction wrote in Russian was mm, dominating. There were more books written in Russian by the writers who identified themselves as Ukrainians, and the quality was in general better. That's when it's when we speak about the genre literature, because there was a parallel world, so to say, of so-called chimerical prose, chimerna prosa. It was a Ukrainian analog of the Latin American magical realism. It started around 1970, and there were a number of books that describe the Ukrainian past and present more or less the same way as Garcia Marquez or Carpentier or Cortázar describe their own land. But in as the 100 Years of Solitude described Columbia's 20th century. So, for example, Ukrainian writer Valery Shevchuk described the Ukrainian 20th century in the same, not in the same way, but in his own way, as it's too a family chronicle. It's full of mystical elements. It contains tales within tales, retold folk tales, and so on. And this chimerical literature continues to this very day. For example, the best known and simply the best Ukrainian poet and novelist of today, Serhiy Zhadan, wrote a number of novels that were translated into French and into English and other languages. For example, his novel Voroshilov the French translation is called La Route du Donbass, the Road of Donbass, and the English American translation is called Voroshilov. That's the original novel. It's a tale published in 2010. It was written in Ukrainian, as every other Zhadan's book. It's a tale about the search for yourself and for your own land, which becomes the search for the transcendence. You can you can become the part of your own land. You can make your land, your country, your Ukraine, your own, and you can become the part of the land of the earth only by symbolical dying, by walking from this world to another one. It's a very complicated and deep novel, and it couldn't be written without the tradition of chimerical prose from the 1970s and 1980s. But the genre literature, the genre science fiction or fantasy, in the first decade of the independent Ukraine was written mainly in Russian and published mostly in Russia. That's because there were some very serious reason for that. The Russian book was domineering on the Ukrainian market till the start of the war, till 2014. And it was very hard to sell to the Ukrainian reader the book written in Ukrainian, especially the translation of the well-known in Russian translation Western novel, or it was very hard to tell the publishers or readers, look, this is good, this is really good, it worth by publishing, buying, and reading. For example, one of the main Ukrainian publishing houses that now publishes the translations of Terry Pratchett and a lot of other fantasy writers, about 15 years ago, adamantly said, no fantasy. Our Ukrainian readers do not read fantasy. But time changed, and I'd say that those writers who started to write in Russian in 1980s or early 21st century, they understood that they can become the part of the Ukrainian culture, of the modern Ukrainian literature, only by translating themselves into Ukrainian or by writing in Ukrainian in the first place. So now we have, for example, one of the best Ukrainian fantasy writers, my co-author Volodymyr Arenev. He started to write his fantasy in Russian, and at the same time he self-translated it into Ukrainian, so he could publish it here. And now for the last decade or even more, he writes only in Ukrainian. Or, for example, one of the most popular Ukrainian writer of today, Ilarion Pavlyuk. His right novel was sold, I think, about 100,000 copies. He still writes in Russian, but he doesn't publish in Russian. He gives his novel to the translators, and they are published in Ukrainian for the first place. So nobody except his translators saw the original text. And there I can name a great number of writers who decidedly moved from the Russian market to the Ukrainian market, and what's more important, from a Russian cultural space to the Ukrainian one. So when the early works were heavily influenced by the Russian writers, Russian culture, Russian memes, Russian traditions, now they are firmly grounded in the Ukrainian tradition. And there were some very talented writers of the 1990s who basically formed the post-Soviet Ukrainian fantasy, but they didn't make the choice. They refused to make this choice, and then they remained in the Russian cultural space. And so it's a pity, but it's inevitable result. They are basically non-existent in the modern Ukrainian literature, though they were very influential 20, 25 years ago.
So when we're talking about this divide, this early exclusion of fantasy, um, so here we're talking about genre fantasy, perhaps reflecting readings of Tolkien and Pratchett and some of those Anglo-American writers, or is it fantasy much more broadly conceived, including fantasy that might be rooted in Ukrainian folk traditions, or uh, in this in the same way that Tolkien was rooted in kind of a mixture of Celtic, British, and of course, and Wagner's Germanic traditions.
I'd say that when Tolkien was translated into Russian in 1980s, into Ukrainian, well, about a quarter century later, it had an enormous influence. Tolkien, Le Guin, and other writers showed what can be done in the field that was basically forbidden in the Soviet Union. And so a number of writers wrote on about the fairy lands that had nothing in common with Ukrainian folklore. But very swiftly, they saw the potential of a combination of the Western genre, fantasy, with the local traditions. So, for example, Marina and Sergei Dechenko, writers from Kiev, they wrote fantasy novels that were basically that used the plots from classical Ukrainian literature of the modernism. So we have this tradition, we have these well-known plots, and what if we move these plots into the heroic fantasy mode, or urban fantasy? For example, I mentioned Kotyubinsky's tale, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, about the life in Carpathians at the beginning of the 20th century, and Dechenko rewrote it as an urban fantasy that take place in the more or less well-known Ukrainian city of the 1990s. And other writers continued to do so. They got them basics of different genres, not only fantasy but science fiction as well. They know what can be done, what has been done with in these genres in the English or American literature, and they make their original or more, less original or completely original works based upon the local history, the local tradition, the local folklore, and the models that Anglo-American science fiction and fantasy can give us. For example, one of the most popular the most popular science fiction work of the last decade is novel The Colony by Max Kidruk, one of the most most popular, well-known Ukrainian writers of today. So what did he do? He took basically the scheme of the model of Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars and wrote his own version of the colonization of Mars that includes, of course, the colonies from Ukraine. It's work that, as the works of the early 20th century, describe the future not only of Earth, not only of Mars, but of Ukraine as a part of the world history. Other writers are even more original in their works. For example, there are books that combine a space opera with Lovecraft's tale, or mythological tales that can be well. One moment, I try to found a parallel in the English language fantasy. Okay, tales, mythological tales in the vein of Le Guin, but based upon Ukrainian folklore. So in some cases, as with Kidruk, you can tell with certainty that he read such and such Western science fiction. In other cases, we have the feeling that this work belongs to the same thematic line, the same genre modification that well-known Western works, but they are very original, and we don't read them as remakes of some other works. For example, the writer can use the elements of the European mythology, dragons, or Rumpelstiltskin, or Tom Tit Tot in Ukrainian or in English folklore, or other elements, but they combine in the unique way. And what seems most important to me, all these works can speak, and they do speak, about the things that are very important to the modern Ukrainian readers, to the readers that live in the times of war. And there can be direct allusions to the Russian-Ukraine war. There can be no direct parallels, but the best works of the Ukrainian speculative fiction writers of the last decades, they do speak about what it is to remain
live in the shadow,
to live in the battlefield, to retain your national identity, to what is to have an identity, what is to have multiple identities, what is to retain a memory that was forbidden for decades or centuries. And so even when the modern writer writes about, for example, times of Kievan Rus, in a way, he or she still writes about what is important today. Of course, there are works that are completely escapist, that are written just to make some kind of entertainment in the dark times. But I think that that mostly Ukrainian speculative fiction writers are very conscious about what they do and when they do it. They do it now and here.
So your story in Embroidered Worlds, Big Nose and the Faun, which indeed kind of uses European mythology in the sense of Greco-Roman mythology, with the faun and the Pan is dead. Spoilers. Was that story written since the invasion of 2020, or was it written since the fighting began around Donetsk and the eastern parts? Was that story kind of a story? Do you feel that the story is in part let us say, around the metaphor or of an old world breaking down, of an old world fading away due to events?
No, it was written in 1998, so it was rather, I didn't think about it at the time, the old Soviet world crumbling and the new world appearing. But really, I wrote it as a story about hope in the darkest times, and in that sense, it still actually important in some ways for the modern readers, and so it's a great honor for me that this story was chosen to represent modern fantasy in the Embroidered Worlds anthology.
Your story, or your mention of a novel, The Colony, about the colonization of Mars, in part by Ukrainians, kind of prompts me to ask, as a Canadian, if there is any influence of the Ukrainian diaspora on Ukrainian science fiction and fantasy, in the sense that, for instance, a science fiction story about the colonization of Mars by Ukrainians might be able to draw, I don't know, on the Ukrainian settlers in Canada, for instance, and the experience of Ukrainian settlers in Canada. Do you know? But more generally, is there any kind of use of awareness of experiences of the Ukrainian diaspora influencing Ukrainian literature in Ukraine?
I don't think that Ukrainian diaspora had a direct influence upon Ukrainian science fiction, but there are some works that describe the life of not Canadian but Brazilian diaspora, and it's another genre that we didn't mention today. It's alternate history or secret history. So there is a tale about a novel, for example, about the Prince of Austro-Hungary, who in our reality committed suicide, but in the alternate reality he went to Brazil and became a part of Ukrainian diaspora there. So it's at the same time an alternate history and the accurate description of Ukrainian immigrants in South America. And because Ukrainian writers that lived in Germany or Canada or Brazil or United States, they were free to write whatever they want. So I can't say that the influence that they had influence in terms of the genre, but they certainly showed how to work freely, and so we can say that modern writers of, for example, chimerical prose in Ukraine are really influenced, among others, by the diaspora writers.
Hmm. Well, our time is almost up. Thinking perhaps of ending with science fiction. It's my preferred genre, and I was kind of wondering. Uh, yeah, I've also heard that currently, since the beginning of the currently hotter phase of the war, in Russia, there's a lot of well, basically future war fiction or war fiction involving Russian triumphalism. Um, and one of the stories in Embroidered World's end was have to the one with a time loop, ending with a bombard. I think it takes place in part on the cruiser Moskva that was destroyed by the Ukrainians, and ends with a bombardment of I think a Russian airbase. So there you see a story that is very much rooted in the current phase of the war. Is there a lot more of that? And perhaps kind of future war scenarios where Ukraine wins, and what that might look like.
There are, of course, works that describe the current war as in a metaphorical way or directly with some elements of science fiction or mythology. But in this, there is no border between genre literature and mainstream literature. For example, one of the most well-respected today writers of the Ukrainian mainstream, Sofia Andrukhovich, just published a novel, I haven't read it yet, about Ukraine after the victory. Not about the victory itself, but what it will be to live in Ukraine that remained independent and won the war. And some years ago, there was a movie based on the same premise. Okay, we won. What now? So I haven't read works that focus on revenge, destruction of Russia, and so on. Though all the works that describe the future Ukraine, of course, are based upon the premise that we will win. There were some writers in Donetsk and Luhansk that became collaborators with them. Russian invaders that even in the 1990s wrote about the future victories of the new Russian Empire. But I think that Ukrainians are rather self-critical and self-ironic to write some triumphant fairy tales about the future war. The most important question that Ukrainian speculative fiction asks now is what has to be done and what we are and what we will be when we win.
Mm-hmm. That I'll just add that the story I was referring to in Embroidered Worlds is called in English Neptune's Day by Ostap Ukhainets. Die Dien Neptuna, I think, rough looking at the Cyrillic, translated by Oksana Katsaniska. And outside of the context of the war, are there recent works of science fiction that should be noted and cited here in Ukrainian science fiction that you left an impression on you, perhaps?
I've already said that the writer I think is one of the most talented in today Ukrainian speculative fiction is Volodymyr Arenev. And one of his stories is presented in the Embroidered Worlds too. I hope that his trilogy about the fantasy world that has direct connections with our war, or his fantasy novel, The Bewitched Sword, about that combines the history of today's war with medieval Scandinavia and medieval Rus. I hope they will be translated into European languages, because they are among the best works of speculative fiction in Ukraine, and they can speak to the readers abroad as well. They are not just about Ukraine. They are clearly influenced by the life in Ukraine, by Ukrainian history, Ukrainian mythology, but they are talented because they combine the universal themes with the national ones.
Well, certainly Tolkien's Lord of the Rings
Mhm.
was influenced in part by the two world wars. And so there are certainly precedents for kind of the context shaping a major work without necessarily being about those two world wars. I think we've come close to the end of our hour. I hope it's been enjoyable for everybody who's listening. I also hope Sibyl is here to kind of close things off. Um, and so I will end by thanking you
Thank you.
and and wishing you the best for the next few weeks, months, and years. And we we all feel that it's a war that has great stakes for everybody around in at least the Western world, and perhaps beyond that. Do you have any final word that you want to put out?
I'd like to thank you and to thank all the participants of the event, and I hope that I'm sure that Ukraine will win, and I hope that Ukrainian literature, not only speculative fiction, but all the masterpieces that we have in our history, will be translated and will be well known in the world. And American historian Timothy Snyder said about Sergei Zhadan, who I mentioned, Zhadan has to held not a rifle but a Nobel Prize in his hands, and I hope someday it will be the case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sibyl?